Hello everyone, welcome to ICC's Game of the Week with your host as always, Joel Benjamin. One would have to say the London Classic was a very successful event. It's hard to say if the soccer-style scoring, with 3 points for a win and 1 for a draw, had anything to do with it, but there were a lot of decisive games and no less than 4 players who spent time in first place well into the event. Carlsen, McShane, and Nakamura all threatened, but Vladimir Kramnik took first place by virtue of sweeping the host country players and drawing everyone else. Nakamura's second place finish was a nice comeback result after mostly slumping after starting the year with a huge victory in Vacanze. Now his fighting spirit was well on display in Hikaru's 5th round victory over David Howell. Nakamura played the English, an opening that is becoming more popular among top grandmasters for the reason that Nakamura liked in this game. It permits more maneuvering without long theoretical variations and simplification that can kill the struggle before it gets going. Now, after subjecting this game to deep analysis, I found that there was actually a lot more going on under the surface than I realized at the time. So let's uncover those secrets now. Nakamura playing white against Howell. And as I alluded to, Hikaru played c4. Of course, he can play pretty much anything on move 1. But he goes for c4. And c4 is a move that a lot of grandmasters play against someone if they're expecting a Grunfeld especially, and a couple of other openings like the Nimzo-Indian or maybe even the Slav that they might want to try to cause problems for by move order. But of course, c4 permits e5, the king's English, and that's what Howell goes for. Knight c3, knight f6, and now g3. Now, I had the privilege of doing the broadcast the day of this game in ICC with Yasser Sarawan, of course, is an English expert from way back when. And he told me that he always found that this move to be slightly inaccurate because of c6 going for the big center, and if d4, this is how he liked to meet c6, but in this case with the moves knight f6 and knight c3 in, he didn't like it so much because eventually white would have to capture on d5, and then after the knight would come to c6 driving away the queen would move, and then black would get to push further d4, d5, d4 with tempo on the knight. So he preferred to get this position after this transaction with d4 without the knight on c3 and the knight on f6. For instance, g3 on move 2, he wouldn't be worrying too much against this c6 idea. Now, most grandmasters play knight f3 on move 3 for rather a different reason. After knight c6, they want to lure the knight to c6, and then after g3, bishop b4, white has extra options. For instance, white can play knight to d5 right away, and if black exchanges, then the pawn captures and hits this knight on d4. Now that's just one of the many lines. Black can play knight d4 here and trade knights again. After knight d5, of course, there are many continuations. Bishop c5 and e4 are also important moves. But just, well, if white doesn't play knight d5, there are a lot of variations where he can try it a move later. A move or two later, let's say. Now, with g3, bishop b4, now if white continues bishop g2 and black castles, if white is going to put the knight on f3, then black can play rook e8 and maintain some options about where to develop that knight, the b8 knight, also again avoiding the problems related to knight to d5. Now white can play e4 in this kind of position. That's a whole other story. But here black is going to be in position to play perhaps c6 and d5 or a6 and b5 and try to break at that center in some dynamic way. So the bishop b4, Nakamura plays knight f3, and again he's trying to coax that knight to c6 and get to the variations that I mentioned before. Now, okay, Howell takes the knight on c3 right away, and that puts an end to any knight d5 possibilities once and for all. It's possible to capture either way, but Nakamura captures towards the center, building a mass of pawns there. And now knight c6. So Howell apparently doesn't mind putting the knight on c6 now that there is no more knight d5. So both sides develop. And rook e8. Here, Black is delaying the advance e4, and one reason for that is that if Black plays e4 sooner, White, of course, White has a lot of options as to where to move the knight, but not only White has those options, but next move he might follow up with f3 to try to break up the center like that and to maintain a big mass of pawns in the middle of the board. So rook e8, d3. Now if Black had dilly-dallied and allowed White to play e4, he would have a nice grip on the center and probably would move the knight from f3 and play f4 and so on. But e4 is really the main idea for Black in this whole bishop b4 system. And knight d4. And a few captures. We have a position that is fairly standard. Now Nakamura plays bishop e3, which doesn't really seem to be the right place to put the bishop. Bishop g5, on the other hand, is not really dangerous for Black because Black can kick it, and the queen is counterattacking the d4 pawn, so White isn't going to win any material here, and has given up the bishop pair, which is his main trump in the position. Now here there was a heavyweight game contested from this position, Aronian against Gelfand from the 2008 Olympiad. Let's have a little bit of a look at that one. Rook to b1, that game went. Then h6 to prevent bishop g5 once and for all. Bishop f4, b6, it's kind of along the lines of this game. But now bishop e5, so White is putting pressure on the center, and Gelfand felt that he needed to play c6 to safeguard there. h3, a very useful move to prevent knight or bishop from coming to g4. Bishop e6, rook to c1, rook c8, f4. Now the game kind of came to a bit of a crisis as Black felt that he had to give up the center now. f5 could be a threat here. He took on c4 and played b5. And now Aronian played d5, very sharp move, which is probably not totally correct. And after this continuation, takes, rook trade, queen check, king h2, very forcing. Queen takes h6, and finally queen b2. And although the king side got weakened, Black's king side actually, Aronian really needed to look for a draw at this moment, which he probably could have made, but didn't play correctly and ended up losing the game. Of course, here rook f4 is met by rook e4, preventing any kind of nasty mating ideas. So that's an example of a major Grandmaster game from this position. Now, Nakamura played bishop e3. It seems to me the bishop really belongs to go to f4 along the lines of what Aronian did there, and also what Nakamura does later in this game. So h6, always going to be a useful move, and h3, certainly a useful move for White as well. And here Black plays b6, which is a common enough move, but very often it's provoked by White, and Black plays it in order to be able to develop the bishop along the original diagonal. But in this game, Howell actually fianchettos it, which is not all that common from what I could tell in this variation. And probably not really a great idea if Black isn't going to succeed in trading bishops on the long diagonal. Now to b6, the white rook went to c1. You can argue that that whatever tempo Nakamura loses with bishop e3 to f4 in this game, he gains back by putting the rook on c1 in one go. And now queen d7, which is a move that is really committing black to the fianchetto development of the bishop. Now, during the game, Yasser was suggesting bishop b7 immediately with ideas of maybe trying rook b8 and then capturing on c4, kind of along the lines of getting a position along the lines of Petrov's defense. I don't think that black would have gotten that far. Maybe white would have advanced c5 before the capture. In any case, if white had played bishop f4, we might well have transposed into the game. So queen d7. Bishop b5, and this is a little bit awkward for black because the knight now has to move away from the center, and that's, well, one argument you could have against putting the queen on d7 is black doesn't want to see bishop takes f6 here. Now, during the broadcast, Yasser speculated on rook e6, which I thought looked awkward, but actually both of us missed the tactical point that white can play bishop takes c7, a rather major flaw there. If queen takes, c takes d5 is hitting this rook and the queen on c7. So rook e6, not really an option. So I think knight h7 is forced. I don't think black can really allow the pawns to be doubled there. And now it's an interesting moment because when we were looking at this live, we considered the move c takes d5. Triple pawns, triple strength. I used to hear people say in the old days. But there's a threat to take on c7, and black doesn't want to give that pawn up. So you might see rook c8, and then queen g4, f5, queen g6. And this variation we looked at during the game, knight f8, queen h5. Now black can take on d5, but white will win this pawn on f5. And I think that will give some advantage, because that bishop on e5 is not going anywhere for quite some time. So that looked like an advantageous continuation. And putting the game on the computer then brings up another possibility of queen g4 right away. Now if black plays f5, white can move the queen away and keep the tension in the center, and this bishop on e5 is eternal on that square. It can't be kicked back by f6 anymore. But if black trades on g4, I think he's going to experience some trouble defending his center and queen side, and white seems to have some nice pressure here. But Hikaru went in a completely different direction. Perhaps he's afraid that he might be simplifying too much, and that he wanted to keep a complicated struggle. Certainly aware that Howell has a penchant for time pressure, and maybe did not want to bring about the crisis in the game too early. So he went a totally different direction by playing c5, actually kind of locking the center and keeping this bishop on b7 out of play for quite some time, and perhaps looking for kingside attack. And this move also has its virtues as well. It cannot be denied. And first of all, black has to consider the possibility that white will take on b6 if he doesn't do anything about it, as a rook can come to c7. So black needs some kind of defensive move there, and I think in hindsight he might well have considered c6 here, just to try to blunt that pressure on c7. I think Howell wanted to keep some options open. He thought, well, there was some chance that maybe that diagonal might get open. The long diagonal might get open later on, but the move rook a c8 invited a lot of trouble along this h3 c8 diagonal, which Nakamura gets on right away, h4, with the plan of king h2 and bishop h3. So now came knight to f8. Well, in hindsight, black might have considered kicking the bishop back from e5 right away with f6, because it actually becomes a little bit tricky after the move king h2 Now I think f6 is already a problem. If bishop h3, now, unless black wants to give an exchange, he has to put the knight in the way, knight e6. But now white can sacrifice the piece, bishop f6 and rook e1. And black cannot avoid giving back the piece. Not only does white have this pressure on e6 and queen g4 check coming, but there's also the move c6, which can be useful to put another piece on prise to prevent black from being able to defend. Queen f7 is not a move because white can take on e6 and then queen g4 check. The king doesn't have the f7 square. If something like f5, which is a good defensive move in a lot of other sacrifice variations, white can even throw in the move c6 and then takes. And now black has an extra piece hanging over here on c6 and doesn't really have a good defense against this queen coming to g4. So in the sacrifice line, bishop takes f6, white is going to get the piece back with a better game. So Howell plays b takes e5. This is a stronger move. Bishop h3, knight e6. Now white has the option of taking with a pawn, but in this case, black plays d4. We can see why Howell didn't want to play c6. Now he's opened up this long diagonal, and he has a perfectly good game there. So d takes c5 is not the right move. So rook takes c5 was played instead. And now f6. And here bishop takes f6 is again tempting, but seems to come up short. Now black has a number of defensive ideas. f5 seems to work okay here. Bishop f5 and queen f7. And to note also there's counterattacking possibilities with this pawn at f2 hanging, but certainly a major point here is that if white takes on e6 and checks, because there's no more pawn on f6, black can just interpose and doesn't get his rook taken off. So instead of sacrificing, Nakamura retreats, bishop f4. And now it seems to me queen f7 seems a bit more natural than the move Howell played, and I think the position is close to equal there. But he played queen d8, which seems to be directed against the move rook a5. Nakamura maybe would have been better off, let's say, just retreating this rook along the c-file. If black takes on f4, that could possibly lead to some problems. Of course, his rook on c8 is hanging, but white's king side would be kind of demolished. I don't know if that's something that white should legitimately worry about, that perhaps the computer doesn't see, but he played the move rook a5, hitting the pawn on a7. Now Howell was ready with aggressive continuation c5, although he would have done all right in this position also to play rook a8, because that actually gets the knight out of the pin, which would be pretty useful. And I think his position is more or less okay there as well. But he went for the concrete variations, which perhaps is dangerous with your clock running down. He's already has less than 8 minutes with a whole lot of moves to make to get to the time control, and you can tell that Nakamura must have been salivating at the thought of his opponent being low on time during complications. So first, white grabs the pawn in a7, queen b6, and now rook a4. And this might look like an awkward square, but it's clear that white is considering possibilities of sacrificing the exchange should black take the pawn on d4. And that's what Howell did. But the move c5, c4 was another one that black might well have considered, trying to make some compensation with a passed c-pawn with a rook backing it up. But instead he played knight takes d4. And now we start to get some really interesting tactics. First of all, the rook is hanging on c8, and it can be taken now and in many other moments. But this, definitely going to be some compensation for black. White is going to be missing of not only a really active piece, but an important defender of the king side. Black might very well take with the bishop with ideas of following up with queen e6 and maybe coming in here and harassing that king, which has lost a defender. In practical terms, it's just not a move that the Grandmaster really wants to play, because he goes from kind of having an initiative to being forced to defend. All right, for instance, if white takes this rook on c8, black might take with the bishop with ideas of queen e6 and queen h3, taking advantage of those sensitive light squares that the bishop has abandoned, and black could get some real counter chances there. And that's really no fun to defend when you've got active pieces to start with. So I certainly understand Nakamura not taking that rook here and actually just really never taking it. He starts with queen h5, and this was a move that that Yasser and I applauded when we saw it, because we liked ideas of rook takes d4 and bishop f5, with aiming to penetrate in with the queen, as well as the sacrifice bishop takes h6. These moves are all in the air after queen h5. Now Howell plays queen c6 and actually used up almost all of his time before playing this terrible lemon. Black is attacking the rook, trying to improve the position of his queen, but it's actually quite an unimprovement, because this queen, there's a lot of negatives to this move. First of all, the queen gives up control of a7, where that rook can come into, and also gives up the b file, where the other rook can come to. And on top of that, it also sets black up for troubles on the c line, which show up in tactical variations as well. Now, instead of that move, black had pretty decent alternatives. First of all, rook c d8. Basically, it really isn't anything special happening to black after that move. If rook takes d4, pawn takes d4, bishop f5, black has bishop c8. And if he trades that bishop, then his king is quite safe. So it doesn't give white time to play queen g6 and queen h7. So that sacrifice doesn't seem anything special. White can also sacrifice bishop takes h6. Now, I don't think that black should get greedy and try to win. Let's say rook e7, bishop f4. Now queen b5, white would sacrifice by bishop f5. This is an example of the kind of thing black has to avoid. His king is under very, very heavy attack here. But after bishop takes h6, black can just take on h6. Black can just take on h6, and white has a perpetual check, but nothing more than that. So rook c d8, just moving the attacked rook, very obvious move, and I don't really see anything wrong with it. Black wants to be ambitious and avoid the perpetual. He can play f5, and this move is okay too. Now the queen is defending along the third rank, so that kills any ideas of bishop takes h6, and white can again play rook takes d4 as sacrifice, but again it's not decisive in any way. If white takes the bishop, there isn't even a threat to get the queen to h7 with the queen in b6 guarding. Black can just move the rook away, rook a8, for instance. So white certainly has a lot of compensation for the exchange, but it's in no way decisive. So to queen h5, queen c6 was a big mistake. And now again, white doesn't go for bishop takes rook on c8. I think that's certainly a good decision, even if the computer thinks white has a good position after that move. I think practically speaking, white should not go in that direction, especially because there are other very good possibilities that he might go for. So I didn't expect that, but Yasser and I were a bit surprised that Hikaru did not play rook takes d4, this thematic exchange sacrifice. And now after c takes d4, we were just kind of thinking about bishop f5. Let's say king f8, queen g6. This position is very promising for white, no question. It's an advantage, very, very strong attack. But I think instead of bishop f5, I think rook c1 maybe is a forced win. Now after rook c1, the queen kind of has to stay on e8. For one thing, black wants to avoid rook c7. Also needs to guard the e8 square because something like queen b6 actually a very simple win for white. It's just to take the rook and either take the rook on e8 next or in the end win the bishop on c8 with a check. Yeah, so clearly the queen is forced to go to either b5 or a4. Queen b5 looks a little bit better defensively. Queen b5 and now queen g6. Black is amazingly helpless in this position. Rook takes c1, bishop takes c1. Now there's just really no way to go about defending this. Bishop c8 is a move that, of course, black would love to get in, but after bishop takes h6, black is just totally wrong-footed. He's got to defend g7. Queen can't come back to b7 because the rook is hanging. Because the queen has no other way to defend. And rook e7 drops the bishop on c8. So if black can't play bishop c8, he really doesn't have a way to stem the attack. And so we can see some other variations. For instance, bishop c6, maybe hoping to get in bishop d7. Now we get bishop f5. Black is really thrown on the defensive. And black has various options, move to move, but none of them are particularly good. Bishop g6 seems actually even stronger than bishop a3 check. Rook moves away. Now white can go in and take some pawns, but actually even most decisive is to be patient, threaten bishop d6, king e7, and now g4, well, the computer move, that's the star move, although white has other moves to probably get a winning advantage. But after g4, the black king is in a lot of trouble. King e6, let's say, bishop f5 check, king f7, and now g5. And basically, black can't avoid mates. Once the H file is opened, that sets up various thematic mating nets like this one, queen g6, and if the king comes back, then there's a mate on the H file. So basically, rook takes d4 was decisive. So I was kind of surprised when Hikaru actually played rook b1 fairly quickly, not going for rook takes d4, which looked very strong. But on the other hand, this move is maybe even more unpleasant for an opponent in time pressure because, rook takes d4, at least black gets to pound out one move and maybe a second one he might have planned. But now it's very hard to figure out what to do. And Howell, again, does not play the best move here with rook a8. Now, let's see what else he could have done. Rook c d8 is actually an interesting try because, again, there's rook takes d4. And if c takes d4, rook c1 here is very, very strong because the rook penetrating to c7 is really going to end the game. Now, black can try here rook to e5, and bishop takes e5, queen takes c1, bishop takes f6 is totally decisive. The black king side falling apart. If pawn takes, white has a nice finish. Bishop e6, king h8, and then f4, blocking out the queen, threatening to take on h6, and black has no way to keep the white queen from a decisive penetration. For instance, as the queen comes back, queen f6, and the rook on d8 is hanging. So if we back up, the position after rook takes d4, black actually has a remarkable resource here. He can play simply rook e7, and it transpires as rook on d4 is trapped. So white still has some work to do to prove his position. But of course, since white was prepared to sacrifice an exchange there, it's not really a surprise that this is not going to be a great defense. Rook c1 is a strong move here. Now the queen moves. Let's say if the queen goes to b6, here white can actually hold on to his material if he wants. Rook a4, bishop c6, rook a3, queen b2, forking a3 and f2. But now the rook escapes. Rook e2, and white can just simply defend rook g1, and the extra piece should prove to be decisive. And white could very well decide to play actually for the attack rather than trying to hold on to the piece with rook a4. But if black should prevent that move with queen to b5, then he runs into other problems. White can play bishop takes h6. Now the queen is not defending along the third rank, defending his f6 pawn, which was kind of important. And black takes the rook, bishop f5 is just a completely decisive attack. For instance, if takes, queen g6 check, rook g7, bishop e6, just kind of familiar mating patterns. King f8, queen f6 wins the rook, and with mate following soon, or king h8. And we see again the hanging rook on d8 in this particular tactical variation. So we back up to the position after rook b1. So that was rook c d8. Seems to lose to rook takes d4, but black can try f5 here, and maybe that's the best hope. Again, rook takes d4 is possible, but c takes d4. As I mentioned before, the bishop take on f5 isn't really a checkmate. It doesn't have that queen g6, queen h7 idea, or bishop takes h6, because the queen is now defending along the third rank. So this is playable, but not decisive. Probably better than the sacrifice is now to play rook a7, and we see this is an additional possibility that came about because of black's unfortunate 26th move. And so after rook a7, rook e7, a4, the more you look at this position, you more see that black just has problems. It's just kind of overextended against the bishop pair trying to defend everything. And white has a very big edge. Probably under the circumstances of the time pressure, would have been able to win the game. It's almost impossible for black to avoid making a mistake under that kind of pressure. The move rook a8, actually white has now quite a forced winning position. First, Nakamura takes on a8. Now, if the bishop captures on a8, rook b6 is immediate forced win. If black takes the rook, white simply takes on e8, check, and then takes on a8. But if the queen moves away, well, it has to maintain touch with e8. Well, white has bishop h6, as we've seen before, but now even rook takes f6 is a crushing move. For instance, if black takes, check, we see these possibilities, and at the end bishop h6, and black defends the main on g7. He's going to lose his rook on e8, and more to follow. So bishop takes a8 was even worse. Then rook takes e8. But now Nakamura plays bishop g2 almost right away. And in the past, Nakamura has had a problem with blitzing his opponents when they're in time pressure. It's certainly a tempting thing to do. And bishop g2, he played very quickly. Howell was just about out of time. It's almost an impossible task to defend this position, and he certainly doesn't succeed. I mean, it's be kind of a miracle to even get to the time control. But objectively speaking, bishop g2 is a mistake, And with so much time on the clock, Nakamura really didn't have to spoil the game with that mistake. The correct move is rook e1, threatening to come into e7, and actually Black is really just under tremendous pressure there, and I don't think um, would have been able to save the game. Um, Rook is coming to e7. Actually, there's just really no way for pieces to cover that. Black can play king f8, but bishop takes h6 was just decisive. For instance, takes, and rook e7. Just one example of how rook e1 would be a winning move. So instead of that, we have a little blip with this move bishop g2. Now it threatens very nice threat. Rook takes b7, kind of obvious, but certainly stoppable. But Howell did not manage. Instead of the blunder he plays, he can play f5, and it keeps Black in the game. But upon closer examination, we can see that it probably wouldn't be enough to save the game anyway, and definitely would not have being so low on time. Rook e1 is still a strong move, and after queen d7, now Black can keep the rook out. But queen g6, very strong, threatening to take the h pawn. But in fact, if king h8, even stronger than bishop takes d6, is bishop d6. And again, that rook is getting in. So after queen g6, about the best Black can do is something like bishop c6, bishop takes h6, queen f7, and now queen d6 is a very strong move, keeping the initiative. Queen f6 is actually almost all of the moves just lose immediately. We can see from there, rather than takes, bishop takes d5 check, king h7. The following variation would be possible. Bishop e3, knight e5. Get all the way into the ending. And Black pawn down, I don't think has too much chance to save this one. But certainly f5 would have been the move to try. Instead, Howell blunders with knight e6, and basically rook takes b7. The game is over. Black plays out the string, really. Now White can recoup material. Bishop takes a8, but there is no reason to do so because White can take the pawn on h6, even stronger. The bishop on d5 is an absolute monster. If Black takes the bishop, there's check. Doesn't really matter where the king goes. It's all bad. Queen f6. And knight g7, queen h6. Nice little mate there. So if Black can't take the bishop, he's never going to be able to break this pin on the knight on e6. So move the rook, but the bishop simply retreated. Position is completely hopeless for Black. White already has two pawns for the exchange, and the pawn on c5 is about to drop. The rook d6, and Nakamura cashed in with bishop takes c5. Black just really can't take anything. Queen takes c5, loses the queen on the next move. So after bishop c5, Howell gave back the exchange, but can't take anything more. And now finally in this position, after d4, Black could no longer continue the game. Very often when you're in time pressure, they say the game continues out of inertia. You're blitzing moves, and even when you have no more position, the moves keep coming, but until the time control very often. But in this case, even before then, Black being 3 pawns down, knew he had to give it up. So Nice win there for Hikaru Nakamura. Actually, it was quite a bit more complicated than it seemed at first, and there were some mutual errors, but they were rather subtle, and you needed some analysis to really bring them out. Great result for Nakamura. Ironically, just as he was posting this very nice finish, he announced that he was formally breaking off his arrangement with Garry Kasparov, which had been such big news only a short time before. So he's leaving Kasparov and going to be working on his own or with his own people. But he's got a very nice result to build on. Okay, so that wraps things up. I'm Joel Benjamin. As always, it's a pleasure. And I hope you enjoyed that show and will join me next time on ICC's Game of the Week. Visit www.chess.fm.